Thank you all for having me, inviting me back again this year. I'm really honored to be able to be here and to share in this really inspiring and powerful weekend and community with just a great group of people. So thank you for having me and for going on this journey with me. This presentation today, I want to make this a little bit more of a workshop where we can kind of work through some of these ideas and concepts together. Something that I've noticed throughout all of today's presentations, which has been awesome, is that there's a lot of talk about mindset, right? I think that's so important. And obviously, as a cognitive behavioral therapist, I'll get into that. But I think it's really important that we practice this stuff, because I think the hardest part about it is the implementation. So I'll get into some of that as we go through. So yeah, my presentation's on getting meta with your mindset, and let's jump in. So before we talk about the CBT techniques and like what CBT is, I always like to start with the differentiation between pain and suffering so that we understand how going to therapy, for example, could be helpful. What is the actual influence that therapy can have? So before we dive into that, does anyone want to take a stab at defining pain? It's a quick definition of pain.
Discomfort.
Discomfort, yeah, great. Anything else? Any other things that come up when you think of defining pain? Annoying, yeah.
Frustrating.
Exhausting, yeah. And all of those, when we typically think of pain, we think of physical, right? There's a lot of focus on the physical sensation of pain. Now let's try suffering. How would you define suffering? Hopeless, did someone say?
Emotional.
Yeah. Emotional, yeah. What do you mean by that?
Long term.
No way out.
No way out, yeah. Yeah. What you all are describing that's really important is that suffering is how we relate to pain. Suffering is the relationship that we have with the experience of it. And the thing that I really want to highlight throughout this presentation is that we are talking about chronic pain specifically throughout this, but this is also just being a human. Like, we're people, and we all experience pain through like different iterations of it. So we're talking about like caregivers and spouses and parents, right? Just people. And we also experience suffering. And that's the suffering is really where we can do the most influence in the psychology realm, is to contain and manage the suffering so that you can increase quality of life. And so a lot of what the presentations today that I've noticed have been talking about is the ways that people are coping through mindset and boundary setting and all of these really healthy ways of managing that suffering so that you can make space for your life. So you guys have made this presentation really easy for me today, which I really appreciate. And something that I want to say before we get into what CBT is, a lot of what I'm talking about is how can we use a framework that you can use to influence and understand what you can do. It's not really about just changing a mindset. It's about how do you use that in a way to maximize the influence you have over your experience. I want this to understand it as empowering and being entitled to take care of yourself, and that when we get really good about thinking about our thinking, that's a superpower in that way. Okay, so a little bit about the CBT model. This is kind of a visual of when we're talking about cognitive behavioral therapy, specifically what we're doing. So we start off with a situation that then is connected to all of our reactions. Our thinking, our behaviors, and our emotions are all interconnected. So, for example, you could have a rough night of sleep. The situation could be you have a rough night of sleep, you're up in pain, it's just not a great night, and you have to wake up early for a PT appointment. So if that's the situation, what could you imagine, what would you predict your thoughts might be while you're up in pain at night?
Misery.
Misery. What are we predicting is going to happen in the morning? Not go. Yeah. Right? So the emotions are high. It's 3 o'clock in the morning. We're exhausted and on a number of levels, and frustrated and angry and all of the feelings, high intensity emotion. Our thoughts are not going to that appointment. That's not happening. We've already decided that. And then the behavior usually results in, I've convinced myself that I'm not going. When we look at where CBT can be helpful is we're modulating your thinking or your behavior so that you don't get stuck in that cycle where your emotions just stay really activated and really high. Something that Christy mentioned in her presentation that I thought was so helpful was this idea of toxic positivity. And the reason why that doesn't work is because toxic positivity minimizes or completely disregards emotion, right? So when we're doing this work, when we're doing CBT, we're not saying that you should feel a different way. No, feel how you feel. You're entitled to feel that way. And we actually don't even look to intervene at the emotion level because your emotions are messengers. They're sending messages to your body and to your brain that are important. The thing that we are looking to do, though, is to, through our thinking or our behavior, decrease the intensity of that emotion so that you can make a decision in a way that really is most healthy for you, right? So another example we could use here, a more positive example. You have a situation where you come across, as Christy describes, an energy vampire, right? You come across one of those and your emotions are probably pretty pissed or a little bit like, uh-oh, how am I going to get myself out of this, right? So a little anxiety, maybe a little annoyed, all of those things. And then you have the thought process of, oh, I remember that presentation that Christy did and I know how to handle this. And then your behavior results in healthy boundary setting. And then the emotions, the intensity of that emotion, of that really frustrated, come down because you did something to influence it, right? So again, we're not saying in CBT that we are making you feel better, just by changing the way you think. It's this whole interconnected process. And when you feel confident in being able to do that, you can really think through situations with yourself in the driver's seat, not the thinking or the emotion. So that's really kind of the model in a nutshell. Let's see if there was anything else I wanted to say about that. Okay, so these are cognitive distortions. I know that we have gone through these and they've come up in previous presentations, but I thought it might be helpful to workshop this a little bit together. Because like I said, the thing about CBT is that it's easy to kind of to know this stuff logically, but it's harder to catch it when it's your own brain doing it. We can catch it much easier in other people, but when we're doing it ourselves, it's harder to catch unless we have kind of a container for what it is and what I call common offenders are. We all do these, and we all have a kind of a flavor that we tend to lean toward. But just in general, thinking about your thinking, whatever role you sit in when it comes to chronic pain, could be about chronic pain specifically or not, kind of want to go through these examples and see what you guys come up with related to your experience. So let's start with all or nothing thinking. This is sometimes called black or white thinking. Basically, I'm not perfect. If I'm not perfect, I have failed, or either I do it right or not at all. As you guys think about all or nothing thinking, anybody can think of an example that comes up for you? Yep, in the back.
First thought is that if I'm in pain, it's like, okay, I can't go to school today. And then what I've learned is that because I've missed so much school, that if I'm in pain, see if I can make it to school still.
Yes, that's a great example. Yes, definitely. And I love how you described there that you learned over time how to challenge that thinking, which is key, right? That's great. Any other examples of all or nothing? Yeah, Kristen.
I see a lot with when you're in so much pain and doing like therapy exercises or something, that the idea is if you can't get 8, then you can't do it. When it's like, well, if you can get 1 or 2, hey, that's something, or walking, if you can walk to the end of the driveway
Totally.
3 times a day, rather than a mile, that's something.
Definitely. And something that you said in your presentation too that I wanted to highlight, might as well just do it now, is that the sports mentality is really, really powerful. It's really important because it helps you to identify the mindset you're talking about is having realistic goals for where you are in the moment, rather than pushing yourself to a place where you're going to wind up fighting a process, right? So tolerating practice, tolerating stamina over time and getting better over time is a big part of a sports mentality that I think you're exactly right. All or nothing thinking can get in the way of and make it really hard to tolerate the process of practice and of like building up a stamina, building up endurance or a skill set. Great examples. What about mental filter? This is only paying attention to certain types of evidence. So noticing our failures but not seeing our successes. Any mental filter? Mm-hmm.
So, for instance, my son Steven, who has ADHD, he continually is he doesn't show any emotions.
Mm-hmm.
So, for years, our family is used to that. But when we're out in public, even as a family, you can't tell on any of us if we're happy, sad, or glad. We've been told that so many times, but for somebody like me, it's in my training as an accountant through college not to react.
Mm-hmm.
So when people are trying to push my buttons and get me all woo, it doesn't work.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But we still have emotions
Totally.
because we're human.
Absolutely.
But there's a difference when you have a medical issue and then you have a trained issue. And then I don't like to fail.
Mm-hmm.
I try to be perfect, and it's very hard to not enjoy the failures of life.
Oh yeah, yeah, absolutely. It's hard, and it's a very common way of getting stuck, and it's a hard practice to be able to say, okay, there's a certain filter that I'm using here. What is that filter? And we'll get into some of the deeper parts of this. Why is that the filter that I use? Where did that come from? And how can I try to find some opportunities in my life to try a different filter, to open up my viewpoint on this? Another common mental filter is focusing on the pain experience, but not really focusing on all of the things that you're doing to manage that pain experience. And I think that it's really, when it comes to the mental filter, we want to focus on things that support our emotions in that moment, which is why modulating that emotion is so important. Jumping to conclusions. There are 2 key types of jumping to conclusions, and I heard a couple of examples of these in previous presentations. One is mind reading, imagining that we know what other people are thinking. We think we're really good at that when we're typically not. And fortune telling. We wish that we can predict the future, right? So these are good ones because they're funny in that we become like magicians and psychics, but we're usually wrong. So a couple of examples that came up before were about what other people think of you. That's a huge one, right? There's a self-esteem stuff there. There's definitely this idea of how I'm seeing myself in this situation. Even my partner or my spouse might feel that same way, or I know what they're thinking, right? And so it's really important with this one to catch what we commonly try to predict. Any examples that are coming to mind that are different from the ones that came up in presentations? No, I think that they were pretty much covered. Overgeneralizing is when you see a pattern based upon a single event, or being overly broad in the conclusions that we draw. So for example, I went to see a therapist and I had a terrible experience. All therapists suck, right? That's overgeneralizing. While I would love to definitely make space for that's really a tough situation to go through, a really long 45 minutes with someone if that sucked. We don't want to say that all of them suck. We just have to find a better fit, right? Disqualifying the positive. I think we tend to be really hard on ourselves and can do that a lot. Discounting the good things that have happened. I think that disqualifying the positive can sometimes sound like you're not making enough space for the struggle that's still there. And that's not the point. Again, remembering that what we're trying to do is make sure that the emotional intensity you're feeling matches the facts. So you could feel completely hopeless, but also look at the past week and say, I showed up to all of these things. So like, I get that the hopelessness can still be there, and I don't want to disqualify all of that resilience and all of that work you're doing. It kind of really undoes some of that, right? So I think that's important. And then magnification or catastrophizing and minimization. So blowing things out of proportion or inappropriately shrinking something to make it seem less important. Something I've seen in my experience working with chronic pain is that minimization can happen a lot in a very kind of backdoor way, where it's like trying to push past what you can do to either make something easier for someone else or to show up and not be judged or whatever it is, right? Or to just say like, I'm so tired of this, I'm going to do that, whatever this is, even though I, push myself past my point of what I can do in this moment, and minimize my pain experience. I feel like that is something that I've heard a lot. I'm curious if there are other examples of either magnification or minimization that any of you have. Yeah, in the back.
I have a 15-year-old with all these things with a zebra, and he does try to minimize sometimes, and he minimizes because he's been doing the CBT and the pain CBT since 2015, like so a really long time.
Yeah.
And he will sometimes minimize like cardiac pain or breaks in his like fractures, and he just will say, I think I've got it this time, and I just don't want to make, I've got the POTS, I've got the EDS, I've got the mast cell, I just don't want one more thing, so I think I've got this.
Yeah.
And a lot of times he doesn't, and so it's hard learning how to strike that balance with him.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And it's probably really difficult on the parent end there, because you're trying to trust, what his experience is so that you can figure out how to support him. But if you notice that minimization is happening, you're, walking on eggshells a bit on like pushing, to make sure that he's being honest, but also trying to give him the space to use his voice. It's a tough balance.
Becoming a young adult, he's getting ready to launch it, almost 16. So helping him to understand when he has to make those changes. When it's alertable, when how to deal with things like
Yeah.
fracture. But then I heard something really good at the EDS Society was when you have kids like this, not every fracture means you have to go to an emergency and have it set. And that's really powerful, because he's going to fracture his fingers lots. So not everyone needs to be casted.
Oh, totally.
So just trusting his judgment.
Absolutely, yeah, and something we're going to talk about. Great, that's actually a great transition into the next point that I wanted to talk about, which is the importance of schemas and how schemas can come up. So that example kind of tied back in as we kind of get comfortable with what this is. So I wanted to bring this so for those of you who were here last year, some of that stuff was an overlap, a review. I wanted to take this a step further this year and talk about schemas. So when we get really comfortable with understanding what our cognitive distortions are and we can catch them in our day-to-day lives, it opens up a deeper part of the work in CBT. So before I jump into that, I just want to address a couple of myths that can come up about CBT. I could talk about this for hours. I will not. I have kept it to some very brief points. But a myth about cognitive behavioral therapy is that it's like simply a skills generator, that we teach skills about how you should think, and then you should go out there and think that way instead. And that it's, time limited. There's a lot of information out there about CBT because it's gotten a lot of buzz that's actually inaccurate. And I want to make sure to address it just because I think that it minimizes how hard this work actually really is. You'll see a lot of like self-help books out, which it's great to expose yourself to that information, but if you're having a hard time implementing it, it's because it's hard work and not everything can be reduced to a worksheet. So the first thing I want to say about that is that behavior change is actually very, very difficult. I don't typically get people coming in to see me because they're like, I don't know what goals I have for myself. Typically, I have these goals and I am having a really hard time reaching them. I'm struggling to get there. And that's where our work really comes in, because having a mindset to do this work requires a lot of consistency, a lot of discipline, and we're not always great at that. That's really, really hard. It's an everyday choice. So that's one piece of this. The other part is that we're not information processing robots. You know, like I can teach you these skills. I can teach you automatic thoughts. And you can know what your brain is doing. You can understand, oh, that's all or nothing thinking, but actually still not be seduced to change anything about that. Like, you know, like you could be like, that's all or nothing thinking, doctors suck, and I'm still not gonna find another therapist, right? Like that can be something that happens, and that's really where a therapist can come in and help with that. Because I think, again, it's not just as simple as, oh, I get this, and so now I should be able to just implement it. Usually what I see in this work is that when it's really hard for someone to follow through on goal management, it's not because they don't understand this stuff, it's because there's something deeper that's driving those automatic thoughts, those cognitive distortions, that's on a deeper level. Like we see them day to day, we hear them day to day, but there's actually something deeper. And that's what we call a schema. When I want you to think about how you process information in your brain, we typically have these like chunking or like theme making that happens so that whenever you have an experience, your brain just makes sense of it in a chunk or a theme so that you don't have to relearn the same thing over and over. Really effective, really efficient, but also not completely the best if it's not monitored, because you could have one experience that then you decide, this means I'm a failure, and then look at yourself as a failure in all other situations, right? So that's what a schema is. A schema is you've had a life experience or a series of life experiences where then you develop this framework or belief system to understand yourself, others, the world. Typically, they're more negative. I mean, I would love to say that a lot of the work that I do is positive, but usually people are coming in because it's distressing, the distressing side of the schema that's bothering them, right? So a couple of examples of schemas I have here. Incompetence, I don't feel like I'm competent to handle this. Unworthy, failure. There were a few others that actually came up, especially in the most recent, the previous presentation. Basically, once you understand yourself through a schema, you're going to constantly be interacting with your world to further support that. So, for example, let's say you had a life experience as a kid where you were deprived of some basic needs, or you were deprived of emotional needs or something. That can lead to what we call a deprivation schema. And when you interact with your world, you might be interacting with situations in a way that further supports that you should be deprived of something. So you go to a doctor and the experience wasn't great. And then if you have a deprivation schema, you're more likely to get stuck in all or nothing thinking or catastrophizing or overgeneralizing that I'm not going to get that need met. And that's just the way that you're going to see it because of situations in your life earlier on. And versus someone who doesn't have a deprivation schema might go to that same doctor, have a crappy experience, and then leave and say, I got to find someone else. So the things that bother some people might not bother others. And the reason for that is because we have schemas that are based on our personal life experience. These are just a few examples. Is anyone able to come up with any other examples of maybe a theme of suffering or theme of struggling that could be a schema, a way you view your world? Mm-hmm.
I've noticed in a professional sense, at different levels, when I relate competence and incompetence, as this is from my training, to trust that people will carry through what they're called to do with purpose and with real intent. Just don't act like you're something when you're not that. Carry out the things in life with purpose.
Right.
And with real intent. And I noticed I struggle with trusting people to carry out things.
Oh, yeah.
I'm going to do it myself.
Yeah. Trusting is a good example. Trusting schema. I think another one that came up, especially in the spouse realm, is burden. That's a schema, right? If you see yourself as a burden, you relate with others in ways that supports that. Because, for example, if you see yourself as a burden and you withdraw, you're reinforcing that schema. You're reinforcing that mindset. So the way you behave or don't behave, the way that you engage or choose not to or avoid are all parts of this. And so this work is really helpful because if we can get you to a place where you can see, oh, day to day, these are some of my cognitive distortions. This is what I get stuck in. We bring the work deeper by saying, is there a theme to that? And then how did you make that assumption about yourself? Or how did you learn to understand yourself that way? And then say, oh, we've got to come up with some behavioral exposures. That's where the behavior stuff comes in. We've got to come up with some behavioral exposures to challenge that and see if we can get some corrective data. Can we get you curious enough about maybe that's not right, right? So like if you have a burden schema, we're going to have you go out there and in a safe way with people that you love and trust and you know that you can do this with, lean in, right? Make an ask. With the deprivation schema, we're going to entitle you to get your needs met, right? And so these are some of the ways that we can do some of that really corrective work that helps to have you living a life that's more values focused and less about kind of like inadvertently just staying in a cycle of your own thinking that makes you like understand yourself in maybe an incorrect way. So I wanted to do this exercise with you guys. I want to give you a couple of minutes to think about it. This is one of the ways that I would work with someone to start to identify what some of their schemas are. So I'm going to give you just a minute to think about this. No, you don't have to share examples if you don't feel comfortable, but I want you to think of a recent example in which you got stuck or you were more seduced to engage in unhealthy coping. We all have that gremlin that sits on our shoulder that tells us, we should just do the thing that's going to feel good right now, right? So we're kind of interacting with that gremlin, getting that voice. How did you interact with yourself and or the situation that resulted in the unhealthy coping? So just give you a quick minute to think about any flubs, any stuck, and what was your mindset, or how did you interact with the situation that made that more likely, that unhealthy coping more likely? So before we get into any examples, if anyone wants to share an example, why do you think it would be helpful to have this information? Why do you think it would be helpful to train your brain to pay attention to this kind of stuff?
So you don't go down a rabbit hole?
Yeah, what do you mean by that?
So you just don't, it just doesn't get worse and worse. You can pull yourself out at the start and start putting those thoughts or doing something more constructive. It may not cure the problem, you know, maybe you're in the wrong job, but understanding what about it and finding a workable way out for you.
That's exactly it. Yeah. Was there, did I see any other hands up?
Yeah, I think you can have all the healthy coping skills you want, but if you don't recognize when you need to apply them, you just won't.
Totally. That's exactly it. These are insight-oriented questions that have us put a magnifying glass on just like how we're living. I don't know that we spend a whole bunch of time. Our brains move really fast, right? And when your brain is processing pain too, you're just like, you're more vulnerable to, you know, honing in on certain things and missing other things. It's just natural. We can't process so much at the same time. So I think things like this are really helpful because it puts a magnifying glass on one situation and says, why don't we just like really dissect that rather than making this like large sweeping goal of I have to catch every automatic thought and I have to change all of the behaviors. No, we start with like one situation and say, where was a turning point? Was there an opportunity for a turning point that we missed? And what do our gremlins typically say to us? Like sometimes we set ourselves up a little bit for like an unhealthy coping. Like we'll tell ourselves ahead of something that I'm not going to be able to do it. And we don't actually like fully know that until we say, am I curious enough to see if maybe that's not the entire story? Does anyone have an example that they want to share? Mm-hmm.
I know sometimes in generalizations, people are needed in certain places at certain times in life, and then their own stubbornness will pull them down in that rabbit hole.
Mm-hmm.
Instead of really being vulnerable and saying, okay, I'm needed here, or I'm needed there, anyone,
Mm-hmm.
go for it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
What our family tries to work on is there's so much opportunity. Don't be stuck in the stubborn you.
Yeah, that's a great example. The stubbornness, right, can kind of derail for sure. Yeah, okay.
So I recently put my foot in my mouth with someone. And so I guess I just started feeling really anxious about it. Like my heart was racing, I couldn't focus on anything else. So I guess when I interacted with myself instead, I just sat in it and like hyper focused and fixated on my anxiety about the situation. And then with the situation, I just completely failed to communicate directly with the person who I could have just said something to.
I love, that's a great example, right? Because sometimes the getting stuck piece is just sitting in ruminating or sitting in worrying or sitting in it, right? When there might be an opportunity in front of us that we can't quite see. And I think that's important to recognize too. When your emotions are high, you can't really see that you're stuck. You think that you're working on it because you're like chewing on it, but that's not necessarily working on it. That's more like suffering in it, right? So that's a great example. All right, a little bit easier one maybe, I hope, is now think of a recent example in which you engaged in healthy coping. Time when you were like, okay, good, I got that. Similarly, what did you do and how did you interact with yourself, for example, your self-talk, that drove you to engage in that healthy coping behavior? Yeah, Chrissy.
So just recently, I was around some kind of unsupportive family, and it's very easy to sort of get sucked back into that thinking that puts you in the woe is me.
Oh, yeah.
But to say to yourself, this is going better than it did the last time, or, like realigning your own internal expectations to try to, cope, to be able to take that baby step when you really want a big step.
Oh, yeah. No, and you're bringing up a really important point is it sounds like you get curious about what data is available. We forget to do that, especially when emotions are high. We forget to say, wait, is this as bad as it was? Is it better? Did I do something differently this time? Even if they didn't, right? I think that's really important. Even if other people around you haven't changed, have you done something to change how you approach the situation so that it doesn't bother you as much, or it doesn't take a hold over you as much? And I think something in this work that's so important that I really like to, we could talk about a million different things with this, but boundary setting and healthy boundary setting is really, really crucial. And especially with people who don't get it, or people like family members who, maybe aren't the most supportive, right? That healthy boundary setting is not being rude or mean or unkind. It's a lifeline. And we really work in therapy to empower people and entitle people to do that in their own way, in the style that works for them, but that doesn't get confused. I get a lot of, I don't want to say anything because that's rude, or I don't want to hurt someone's feelings, I don't want to be a bad person. Healthy boundary setting isn't being a bad person. And when you set a boundary and someone violates it, that doesn't discount that you set the boundary. We have to work out some expectations with that person, right? Set realistic expectations of what we're going to get from that person, but that still means that you've done something really healthy and important. Yeah, does anyone have any other thoughts on this one? Healthy coping? Yeah.
I'm having a situation with our Parent-Teacher Association. Nobody volunteers, so I set the boundary and I'm so proud.
That's awesome. That's such a win. Yes.
I can't do Teacher Appreciation Week, but somebody needs to. And they said, okay, so you're going to do it with this person. And I said, no, I can't.
Yeah.
And they said, no, you have to do it. So I arranged, I don't know if anyone's from DC, I arranged for founding fathers to come and cater it.
Perfect. That's perfect. Yeah.
The new president is a micromanager. So she said, no, we're just going to get Einstein bagels, this, and this, or we're going to do it this way. And I got so frustrated. And my husband said, why are you ruminating? Just let it go. And somehow, like so I was actually thinking about that today. Why is it bothering me? Like this need to help, because I can't. I wanted to be here today. I don't want to get candy bars and skip.
Yeah.
Maybe they don't want the candy bars,
Yeah.
So I was like, and what if they get the wrong candy bar? They might not want it. I can't help it. I set it up. So I set that boundary, but I was finding myself looping back.
Oh, yeah.
I was actually thinking when I drove over here, what is it? Because I do a lot of CBT with my son. What is it that's triggering me? So I think I'm doing the right thing. What is it, my past schema?
Yeah.
But I didn't have the language for it. That's making me feel guilty and wanting to be at the school at 7:30 in the morning.
Oh, yeah. Totally. That's a great example. And it really shows how important these schemas, they underlie things and they kind of nag at us even when we're doing the healthy thing.
And then I just
Yeah.
feel guilty not still digging in and doing it, but nobody else is.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, and it's a great example of like how much practice this stuff takes. You practice, you expose yourself, and then each time it should get a little bit easier. And each time you should be able to say, still feel guilty, but not as guilty as the last time, right? But they're strong, they're powerful, and they're constantly looking to kind of catch us. So typically something that we say in this work is every step that you're taking to challenge a schema, it's like a gremlin that you feed gummy bears, and now you're like, no more gummy bears, and it's having a tantrum. It's like, no, what are you doing? Why did you take that away from me? And so it takes a little bit of time for your brain to stop firing off, this is a threat. Because I'm not doing something the same way that I used to, it's a problem. That's really where we have to say, okay, but I want to do this differently. Why? Why am I going to tolerate the gremlin having a temper tantrum in my brain? because it's worth it to me, so that, yeah, maybe I have less pressure, maybe I have less guilt, maybe I have more time to do things that matter to me, and I'm not making an obligatory kind of like to my schema decision, right? So these are really great examples, and they show kind of how wide-ranging this work is. We all have this stuff, we all have our gremlins, and every day finding an opportunity to notice something coming up and getting curious about it is a really good step to practicing some of this work. And it's practice and practice and practice. So if any of this has been, interesting to you, or you feel like it's something that you kind of get on a conceptual level but want support around practicing, I would highly suggest trying CBT. I have here 2 options to find referrals of therapists in your geographic area. Something that can be really confusing about this stuff is, especially with telehealth, whatever clinician you're working with has to be licensed in the state that you live in. So you can go on Association for Behavioral and Cognitive Therapies or Psychology Today, put in where you live, put in CBT. Actually, ABCT are all CBT therapists. And then Psychology Today, you just want to put in CBT, and you should come up with a list of people to check out. I usually always say, if this is your first time in therapy, or if you're looking for a new therapist, it's nice to kind of set up free consultations. A lot of people tend to offer that, to just see if they feel like a good fit, and trust your gut. Therapy is hard work, but you should feel comfortable with the person you're working with. If you don't feel comfortable with the person you're working with, the hard work will be harder. So find a good fit and give it a try. Yeah. Thank you.